September 23, 1944, just after sundown, Camp Hearn, Texas. The cicadas were still singing when the convoy rolled through the gates. Floodlights lit the barbed wire fences, humming faintly, casting long shadows across the gravel yard. Dust trailed the trucks, drifting over the concrete like fog. Inside the canvas-topped beds, the prisoners sat in silence. Over 4,800 German POWs were being held here, deep in the heart of America. Many had been captured in North Africa or Normandy, and now found themselves surrounded not by Allied tanks or strafing planes, but pine trees, farm fields, and a world they couldn't begin to understand. One of them, Unteroffizier Lucas Voss, had survived 3 years of desert fighting under Rommel. He'd seen Italian convoys burn under British artillery. He'd watched friends die in the dunes, eyes open, unblinking under the Mediterranean sun. But nothing prepared him for the sound he heard now, drifting faintly over the walls. It was music. But not like anything he'd heard on the radios back home. This wasn't Wagner or Strauss or the somber military marches they'd played before parades in Stuttgart. This was faster, irregular, brash. A brass trumpet screeched upward, wild and playful, chased by a piano banging in syncopation. Drums rattled like machine gun bursts, but they made people laugh instead of duck for cover. Lucas turned to the man beside him, another soldier named Eberhard from Bremen. "Do you hear that?" Lucas asked, squinting toward the sound. Eberhard tilted his head. "Is that jazz?" They were still sitting in their transport when the gate opened and the guards motioned them down. Armed MPs stood at attention, but no one shouted, no one cursed, and in the distance, just beyond the rows of prisoner barracks, the music grew louder. It wasn't just music, there were voices, laughter. And then, unbelievably, the sound of a woman's voice singing. The next morning the camp looked ordinary enough. Rows of low wooden buildings, guard towers on each corner, barbed wire in concentric circles. But as the sun climbed above the trees, strange things began to happen. At 700, a bell rang not for a roll call but for breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, hot coffee. At 900, the prisoners were given newspapers. The New York Times and Dallas Morning News, delivered daily. At 1,000, American guards handed out letters from wives, from sisters, from mothers. Not German ones, but American. Curious civilians from across the Midwest had written to these so-called enemies. Letters filled with simple things. "Do you like it here? And my son is fighting in Europe. Do you miss your home?" Some of the prisoners wept as they read them. By noon, the confusion was complete. In the yard between the mess hall and the camp theater, the jazz band returned. Not a record, a live band. 4 black musicians from a nearby USO club, instruments polished, suits pressed, came into the camp to play Duke Ellington and Count Basie for the enemy. The POWs gathered by the dozens, then the hundreds, clustering near the open grass. And then the final shock came. 2 American women, Red Cross volunteers in red dresses and white gloves, stepped out from behind the stage truck. And they started to dance. Lucas couldn't move. He stood at the back of the crowd, stunned. Eberhard leaned forward, mouth open. The women twirled between the musicians, laughing, snapping their fingers, swinging their skirts in rhythm. It wasn't sensual. It wasn't even particularly graceful. It was joyful. And the Germans, some with iron crosses still tucked into their shirt collars, others who'd driven tanks through France, watched in absolute disbelief. "Is this some kind of punishment?" someone muttered. Another replied, "No, this is just America." Not all the prisoners laughed. Some scowled, arms crossed. Hardliners, the so-called Fern Foura loyalists, barked slurs under their breath. They called it degenerate, insulting. But no one stopped watching. That night back in the barracks, the conversation never ended. "How can they be so casual?" one man asked. We bombed their cities. They feed us better than our own army did, another said. Did you see the eggs, real eggs? But Lucas only said one thing, quietly to himself. I haven't seen a woman dance since 1939. 3 weeks passed. The routine continued. Every Saturday afternoon the band returned. The women danced. Sometimes there were 3, sometimes 5. Sometimes locals joined in. The prisoners were not allowed to dance with them, of course, but they were allowed to watch, allowed to listen. And eventually, they were allowed to play. It started with a single accordion. Then came a violin, then a clarinet. By mid-October, Camp Hearn had its own prisoner-led jazz ensemble. Eberhard had been a trumpet player before the war. By November, he was playing lead alongside an American guitarist who'd once played in Harlem. They called themselves the Swing Section. The guards didn't stop it. The camp commander, a World War I veteran named Colonel Wesley Harper, encouraged it. He fought in the trenches. He believed morale won wars not just for Americans but for everyone. He issued a memo. Any prisoner who behaves may attend concerts. Music is a privilege of the civilized. Back in Berlin, Reich propaganda reported that American camps were death traps, that the enemy tortured prisoners, starved them. But Lucas had put on 10 pounds since arriving. And now when the band played, he tapped his foot, quietly, at first, then openly. Then on Christmas Eve, when a jazz version of Silent Night played, he cried. Not because he missed home, but because he finally felt human again. At the edge of the yard one evening, Lucas stood alone. Snowflakes drifted through the Texas air like ash. The band played softly behind him. A guard walked over, a young corporal from Iowa named Riley. Not bad, huh? Riley said. I like the part with the horns. Lucas nodded. We didn't know you did this here. Do what? Let enemies dance, let women sing. Riley grinned. You're not enemies anymore, not here. Here you're just men, and men like music. Lucas didn't respond. He watched as one of the women, short, red-haired, laughing, clapped to the rhythm with the drummer. She wasn't afraid, not of him, not of any of them. That more than anything broke him. They had come expecting cages. Instead, they found saxophones. They had come expecting silence. Instead, they found jazz. They had come prepared to resist, but no one had prepared them for kindness. And no one had prepared them for women in red dresses, dancing beneath American stars. By the time spring came to Camp Hearn, the rhythms of captivity had taken on a strange new tempo. The barbed wire still stood, guards still paced the towers with rifles, but no one flinched anymore. No one muttered about escape. The men had settled into a routine that no training, no propaganda, no German officer had prepared them for. They'd expected to be caged like beasts. Instead, they were handed sheet music and chalkboards, coffee and conversation, and on Saturday nights jazz. Lucas now played bass with the swing section. He'd never touched one before the war. Back home he'd worked at a typewriter, keeping ledgers for a textile factory in Mannheim. But Eberhard had shown him the basics. Thumb, pluck, pace, keep the groove. It wasn't precision like Beethoven. It was something looser, something alive. And when the women danced, he played louder. Their names changed from week to week. Eleanor, Ruby, Jean. Volunteers from the USO, college girls from nearby towns, a few Red Cross nurses. Always under guard, always distant but never cold. They laughed, they clapped, they swayed their hips, not to tempt but to lift the air around them. It made the men feel less like prisoners, more like shadows of the lives they had left behind. Some of the hardliners hated it. They sat on benches during the shows, arms folded, eyes sharp, still clinging to a Reich that now only lived in rumor and memory. Lucas watched them sometimes, the ones who refused to clap, who hissed "traitor" under their breath whenever someone whistled at a trumpet solo. But their numbers shrank week by week. The music was winning. Not everyone adjusted the same way. There was a boy named Schmidt from Dresden who tried to hang himself behind the latrines. He'd been caught before the stool kicked free, hauled down by 2 guards and a Polish medic named Dr. Wilkerson. He was recovering now in the infirmary, drawing comic strips in pencil, smiling for the first time in months. Another prisoner, Klaus Mayer, tall, red-faced, formerly a major in the Wehrmacht, refused to attend the concerts altogether. "You forget who you are," he'd sneered once at Lucas. "You forget what they've done to our homeland." Lucas had looked him in the eye. "Maybe I remember what we did to theirs." That ended the conversation. By June, the camp band wasn't just playing for the POWs. They'd been asked to perform outside the wire at a small USO fundraiser hosted in the town of Hearn itself. That was when the guards asked for volunteers to act as musical escorts, carefully selected, double-searched, shadowed by MPs. Lucas was one of them. They rode in the back of a 2-ton truck through the Texas heat, the stars and stripes flying from the gate behind them, not a German flag in sight. Lucas kept his eyes low, not from fear, from disbelief. Civilians lined the roadside. Some waved, some stared. None spat, none jeered. The band played that night under string lights hung from a barn's rafters. Civilians, soldiers, even children watched. Lucas stood to the side, holding the upright bass while Eberhard blew into his trumpet like a man possessed. They played Take the A Train and Stompin' at the Savoy. A 10-year-old boy danced in a circle with his sister. And one woman, a young mother with dark hair, her husband off in France, asked if Lucas needed water. She said it in German. "My father was born in Hamburg," she explained. "He used to whistle this music in the fields. I hope you play something he'd like." Lucas could barely nod. That night back at the camp, no one slept. "You played for Americans," one of the hardliners spat, "like a dog begging scraps." "I played music," Lucas said, not raising his voice. "It's the only thing that still belongs to everyone." The silence that followed was more powerful than any argument. Weeks passed, then months. The war in Europe ended in May. The news reached Camp Hearn through radio and American guards shouting, "It's over, boys, Hitler's dead." Some prisoners cheered. Some collapsed. A few wept quietly, though no one knew whether from relief or regret. But there was no immediate release. They were still prisoners of war, still held under the Geneva Convention until repatriation could be arranged. Some would stay another year, others longer. Now, without the fear of death awaiting their return, something else took root: reflection. Lucas watched as men began writing home, not letters filled with coded reports or hollow declarations of loyalty, but real things. Apologies, questions, hopes. Some started English classes, others painted. The camp published a German-language newspaper written entirely by the POWs. One article described the difference between freedom and permission. The jazz concerts continued, but now the women danced with less caution. They stepped closer to the band. One woman, Carol, a teacher from Austin, handed Eberhard a wrapped package after the show. A pair of trumpet valves he'd complained were sticking. Inside the barracks, no one dared call him a traitor anymore. He'd become too good to insult. The camp commander, Colonel Harper, oversaw it all with a watchful eye. Some thought him naive, others thought him brilliant. He believed in 2 things, respect and rhythm. You give men food, letters, purpose, and they will become human again. On the 4th of July, he invited the entire camp to the edge of the parade ground to watch the local celebration. Fireworks burst over the pine trees. The jazz band played a version of Yankee Doodle so swing-heavy that even the guards danced. Lucas stood with his hands in his pockets. He'd learned the steps by then, watched enough to mimic the sway, the toe taps, the heel turns. He didn't move, but he understood them. Not the women, not the songs. The Americans. He finally understood why they smiled so easily. They weren't weak. They weren't soft, they were free. And they knew it. By late August of 1945, Camp Hearn had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Not the prisoners, not the guards, not even Colonel Harper himself. The war was over, for real this time. Japan had surrendered. Truman's voice had echoed from every radio, and the men in the camp had stood at attention while the American flag flapped high above the yard. Some saluted out of habit, others watched with unreadable faces. But one thing was clear, the world had moved on. Inside the wire, however, the wait had only begun. Most of the Germans had expected to be on the first ships home. Instead, they were told they would remain in American custody, not as punishment, but as part of a controlled demobilization. The military had no intention of sending tens of thousands of able-bodied soldiers back to a broken Europe in a single wave. There would be order, logistics, processing. And so the POWs stayed. Not weeks, not months, many stayed years. But by that fall, few of them still called it prison. The dances hadn't stopped. In fact, they'd gotten more elaborate. There were full evenings now, not just concerts. Wooden floors laid down in the mess hall. Invitations sent to nearby towns. Posters reading Camp Hearn Saturday Swing Night featuring the swing section. It wasn't a joke. Local women still came, now escorted by off-duty guards or Red Cross supervisors. And though the rules were clear, no direct contact, no dancing with prisoners, the lines had softened. Everyone knew who was who, and the prisoners knew better than to press it. They had learned respect. They had learned restraint. But more than that, they had learned to savor the smallest taste of something they'd been denied for years: normalcy. Lucas tuned his bass before every show. He polished it carefully, made adjustments with screws he scavenged from the machine shop. He didn't speak much between songs, but every note he played was precise, and by now he could anticipate Eberhardt's solos like he'd grown up with him. Eberhardt, for his part, had become something of a legend. He composed 3 original swing pieces. One of them, Hearn's Shuffle, was picked up by an American orchestra stationed in Dallas. He didn't brag. He didn't have to. People stood when he took the stage. One Saturday evening, just before the music began, Lucas stepped outside for air. The sun had dipped below the tree line. The yard was glowing with amber light, and he saw a girl, maybe 17, walking toward the dance hall with her mother. The mother smiled at a guard, nodded politely, adjusted her daughter's collar. The girl looked straight ahead, chin high, not defiant, just curious. She passed Lucas without fear. That moment stayed with him, not because of her dress or her eyes or the way her shoes tapped the gravel, but because it had never occurred to him that he was no longer being watched like a threat. He was just part of the evening. That night the band played in the mood, and halfway through the bridge, Lucas forgot he was in a prison camp. For 30 seconds he felt like he was somewhere else, a proper hall, maybe Berlin, maybe Paris. A warm night, good shoes, white shirts, horns cutting through the laughter like smoke. He felt it in his chest, not as memory, not as fantasy. As if it had always been there, waiting. He nearly missed the key change. After the show, Riley, the same guard who'd first spoken to him months ago, handed him a soda. "Hell of a set," Riley said. "I swear you boys could charge admission." Lucas smiled. "If I ever get home, I'll start a club, call it Camp Hearn. Name might be taken." They both laughed. The conversations came easier now, not just with guards but between prisoners too. The hardliners, those who'd once called Lucas a traitor, had grown quiet. Some had been transferred out. Others had simply faded, their voices dimming in the rising tide of normal life. The worst of them, Mayer, had taken to spending long hours in the camp library. He no longer shouted at men during meals. He read American newspapers now. He was last seen requesting English grammar books. "I want to understand the advertisements," he'd said, half apologetically. The camp chaplain, a Southern Baptist named Father Caldwell, held discussions twice a week. Open ones. No sermons, just chairs in a circle. Germans, Americans, black soldiers, white MPs, anyone could come. Topics ranged from philosophy to jazz history to what the word freedom meant after war. Lucas had never spoken during one, until October. Caldwell had asked, "What do you think was the most surprising part of this war?" A young corporal answered, "How many good men died for lies?" Another said, "That I learned to hate people who were just doing their jobs, then learned to unhate 'em." Then Lucas spoke, his voice steady. "I thought we were the best country in the world, that we were destined to win, that we were right and you were wrong." The circle went quiet. "I don't think that anymore, but what I didn't expect was to feel shame not for losing, but for never having known how good it feels to lose your hate." Caldwell looked at him, with something between pity and pride. The man next to Lucas reached over and touched his shoulder. It was Eberhard. That winter, Camp Hearn's newsletter published a piece titled "Bridges Made from Brass," written by an anonymous POW. It described jazz as the only language that lets enemies breathe together without speaking. Colonel Harper pinned it to his office wall. The final swing concert of the year was held on New Year's Eve, 1945. The weather was cold, but the hall was packed. Locals, guards, soldiers, POWs all crowded in. There were decorations, paper lanterns, a banner strung over the rafters that read, "Hear S" to a new tune. The band played until 11:57. Then they paused. Harper took the microphone. "In 3 minutes, 1945 ends, and so does your war. You will all go home soon, some of you next month, some later. But know this, you did more than survive. You showed us that music and dignity and decency are not bound by uniforms." He raised a glass. "To enemies who chose to listen." At midnight they played Auld Lang Syne. One of the women, Ruby, stepped onto the floor and danced alone. Slowly, not theatrically, just one turn, one smile. The band followed her lead. No spotlight, no drama. Just a melody that had outlived the worst thing men could do to each other. Lucas didn't play that part. He stood in the back and watched. When the final note faded, no one clapped. They just stood there together in the silence. And somehow that said everything. The snow melted early that year. By the second week of February, mud pooled along the wire paths between the barracks. The soil was soft, clinging to boots, flattening the grass around the flagpole in the center of the yard. Lucas watched it all from the window of the small music room the guards had let them convert from an old supply shed. He sat with the bass across his knees, not playing, just feeling the wood, running his fingers over the worn grain. The varnish had peeled in some places. The bridge was still cracked, patched with glue someone had borrowed from the woodworking shop. It wasn't beautiful, but it made sound. It spoke. Outside, Riley made his rounds. He didn't carry a rifle anymore, just a holstered sidearm, mostly for protocol. The younger guards had taken to walking the yard with their sleeves rolled up, laughing with the prisoners, trading newspapers, even playing the occasional game of cards when off duty. The wire still stood, but something else had faded, the part that separated one man from another. News from Europe trickled in slowly now. The front page spoke of trials, Nuremberg, Goering. The world was reckoning with itself. In the camp it was no different. Men who'd once led with slogans now sat quietly at dinner. Fewer Siegheils, more apologies. No one announced the change. It crept in like the spring, too slow to notice, too fast to ignore. In the chapel, someone had pinned a quote to the corkboard near the piano. "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." No signature. That week Lucas was called into the administrative office. Colonel Harper greeted him with a nod, then slid a document across the desk. It was printed in triplicate, typed in stiff courier font. A transfer order. "You'll be moving east," Harper said. "Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. They've got a German-language agricultural program up there, teaching men to farm, helping with post-war reconstruction training." Lucas read the paper twice. It wasn't a punishment. It was a step toward going home. "How long?" he asked. "Could be weeks, could be 6 months, but it'll come. Ship manifests are starting up again." Lucas stared at the paper, then he looked at Harper. "Will I be allowed to take the bass?" Harper blinked, then smiled. "I'll sign the damn thing myself." He left that night with no ceremony. A quiet handshake from Riley, a warm goodbye from Eberhard, who promised to keep the swing section alive. Ruby sent a note, folded, unsealed, tucked into the neck of the bass. Lucas didn't read it until the train reached Missouri. It said only one thing: "You didn't just survive, you changed." The next camp was colder, more rigid. Less jazz, more labor. But Lucas carried the rhythm with him. He organized a quartet, taught 3 others to play, wrote letters, dozens, to guards, to the women, to the colonel. And slowly, almost too slowly to track, the war inside him emptied out. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't forgetting. It was something harder, the quiet decision to carry weight without bitterness. Eberhard stayed at Hearn for 6 more months. When his repatriation came, he left behind a suitcase of handwritten sheet music. The Americans made copies. Some ended up in high school bands across Texas. No one knew who wrote them, just that the rhythms were good. By 1947, Camp Hearn had emptied. The fences came down, the towers dismantled. The wooden barracks were sold for lumber. The last American soldier to leave took one final walk across the yard, found an old dog tag half buried in the mud, wiped it clean, and slipped it into his pocket. The music hall remained, not because it had to, because no one could bring themselves to knock it down. Years later, in 1953, a group of American veterans returned to Hearn. They brought their families, their wives, their children. Someone played a recording on a portable phonograph, scratchy but clear, of a band called the Swing Section. It played "It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing." A few of the wives danced. One of them was Ruby. She didn't say much that day, just listened, tapped her foot, smiled a little too long at the music. In Germany, Lucas married a woman named Anna. He opened a music store in Mainz, sold records, tuned pianos. He never advertised. People came anyway. There were rumors. Some said he'd been a war hero. Others said a traitor. Most didn't ask. But every Saturday at noon, he set out a folding chair, tuned the same bass he had carried from Texas, and played for anyone who passed. Sometimes old men stopped. Sometimes children. Sometimes no one at all. He didn't care. He'd long stopped needing to be heard. It was enough just to play. The invitation arrived in April 1962, typed on thick cream stock and mailed from an address Lucas didn't recognize. It came from the city of Austin, written in American English, but with a final line added in German. "Ich wäre an sein Ehr." It had been nearly 17 years since he'd stepped off the military transport in Bremerhaven, his bass case thudding against his knee, the dock still soaked from the night before. He remembered the rain. He remembered the silence. No flags, no family, just the sharp salt air and the sudden awareness that he didn't recognize his own country anymore. But the bass survived. He had carried it down from Wisconsin in a truck filled with men who'd stopped singing by then. He brought it through the ruins of Frankfurt and the ash of the Rhine. The strings wore down. He replaced them with guitar wire. It didn't matter. The sound was still there. Now, nearly 2 decades later, someone remembered. The letter was from the Hearn Historical Society, organizing a reunion, not of veterans or prisoners, but of people who had once shared music together. He read it twice, then placed it in a drawer. For 4 days he didn't touch it. Then on the 5th he packed the bass. The flight to New York was turbulent. the bus to Texas long and dry. He watched the American landscape blur by, highways now not dirt roads, electric billboards, radios built into the seatbacks, everything faster, louder. But somewhere between Dallas and Bryan the past began to return. The trees, the soil, the air. When he stepped off the last shuttle, the sun was low. He stood alone on a narrow gravel road while the driver disappeared down the hill. Ahead of him, the ground stretched wide and flat. Camp Hearn was gone, at least the parts he remembered. The wire fences had vanished. The barracks were just markers now, small signs driven into the earth. Barracks 3, music room. Mess hall, reconstructed site. Guard tower 2, foundation line. But one thing remained. The stage. Someone had rebuilt it plank for plank. Sanded wood, clean nails, no lights, just open sky. A local band was warming up, high school kids mostly. A nervous trombone, a clarinet too bright. But Lucas smiled. He knew the sound, it was imperfect. It was human. He was the only German there at first, but not the only one who remembered. An older man with a limp came up the path with a cane and a Marine cap. His name tag read Riley. He stopped, looked at Lucas for a long time, then stuck out his hand. "Still got that bass?" Lucas nodded, still out of tune. Riley laughed, the same dry rasp from 20 years ago. "They want you to play something later, if you feel up to it." "I'd be honored." The crowd gathered slowly. Former guards, local families, a few students. Then, toward sunset, she arrived. Ruby. Older now, gray curls under a wide straw hat, but the same eyes, the same smile. She hugged Lucas like no time had passed, said nothing, didn't need to. The band began at dusk. Lucas played third, just one song. It wasn't jazz, it was a German lullaby, simple, slow. Afterward, no one clapped, they just listened. Later that night, Ruby joined him by the old fire pit. "You know," she said, "some of the women stopped coming when the dancing started, said it wasn't proper, dancing with prisoners, even at a distance." Lucas tilted his head. "And why did you stay?" She looked out across the grass. "Because for the first time in my life, I saw a man put down his hatred, and I didn't want to miss it." They sat for a long time in silence. Before leaving, Lucas visited the museum gift shop. It was just a corner table in the community center, postcards, old photographs, a few trinkets. He picked up a black and white picture from 1945, a woman dancing in front of a band, her hands raised, her smile wide. It was Ruby, but it could have been. He bought it anyway. Back in Germany, he pinned the photo to the wall above his workbench. The shop had changed names by then. No longer Music House Voss. Now it read simply Jazzhaus. No one asked why. Sometimes, in the late hours, he'd sit alone and play the same 8 bars over and over, fingers tracing notes like steps on familiar roads. Not to remember, but to stay honest. Because in a world that tried to teach him how to kill, Camp Hearn had taught him how to listen. And for the rest of his life, whenever someone asked him what broke the war inside him, he would answer the same way. With a smile. And 2 words. She danced.